Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution tonight for tonight's talk. My name is Joe Houlihan. I run the military history group here at the BRLSI. I know some of you will be regular attenders here. For attendees here, for those of you who are not, the BRLSI, as many people call it, is celebrating its bicentenary next year in 2024. 200 years, not always in this building, but in the city. We will have a whole fantastic array of talks and events going on during 2024. So please feel free to keep an eye on what's going on. And if you want to be added to an email list to be kept informed, feel free to talk to me afterwards. Tonight's talk, I think, is really interesting. It's a fascinating story based on a family memoir. Normally we have a single speaker, but tonight our speaker is going to be interviewed by Peter. So now, please give a warm welcome to tonight's speaker, Felice Hardy.
Thank you all for coming. A very select group.
There's a lot listening online, actually. So it's slightly deceptive. So good evening, everyone. The tennis champion who escaped the Nazis is a dramatic story of family survival and perseverance against all odds. It's a story that begins over 120 years ago and echoes down the generations to the present day in particular. It has lots of tennis in it, but if you come here to listen to a story about a tennis book, you've come to the wrong place, because there is lots of tennis in it, but in essence, it's not a tennis book. It's about the Holocaust. It's not another story, I hasten to add, about the miseries of Auschwitz and the other death camps. In fact, these hardly get a mention. It's about you, Felice, and it's full of hope and rather than despair. I speak from a very important position here of being married to Felice, so I know quite a bit about the book and quite a bit about the content. But researching it and writing it has now been a truly cathartic experience for you, hasn't it? A voyage of discovery that's changed you in many ways. And we've watched you as a family with 3 kids. We watched you change and grow from the experience of finding yourself, if you like. And so I can safely say that from my position in the player's box, so to speak, I've watched in admiration how you've brought your grandparents to life. Now, I knew both grandparents very well. I knew them, obviously, some time ago they died now, but you've carried on thinking about them, and then you decided that you would write this book about them. And not only that, you've given voice to family members and many others who died in sometimes tragic circumstances long before you yourself were born. So tell us, first of all, what made you write this book about Liesl Herbst, that's her name, your grandmother, and she was a pre-war tennis champion of Austria.
There's a sort of howling. It sounds like my dog.
It sounds very like my dog.
Yeah. Companies remembering business, we're trying to get them to stop.
Well, I started in 2015. My daughter, who was a student at the time, said, we don't know anything about our background on your side of the family. We know that they're Austrian. Your mother was Austrian, but that's about it. Really like to know more. So can we go to Austria? Can we go to Vienna, where your mother came from? And she opened her laptop, and she'd already, up on the laptop were cheap flights to Vienna. And she said, look, we can go. And she'd already found somewhere we could go and stay as well when we were there. So I thought about it for a bit, and then I booked 4 tickets, myself and my 3 children, and Peter stayed at home with the dogs, so he couldn't come. And off we went to Vienna. And before I went, I booked a walking tour of Vienna, and that's really where my journey began, because the guide who took us on the tour was really, really helpful. I'd been to Vienna once before, but I hadn't really looked at it in the same way I'd been when I was much younger. And the guide said, by the way, my hobby is helping people research their ancestors who came from Vienna, particularly ones who've got Jewish backgrounds in the Holocaust. And she said, if you want any help, just email me when you get back to England with anything you know, names, any dates of birth, places where people were born, anything at all, and I'll do the rest. So I got home and found a few things I knew about my grandparents, my mother. And then about a week later, up popped an email with enormous amount of information that I didn't know about before. I knew that my grandmother had one sister. Suddenly there were two sisters. I knew about her parents, and vaguely I knew a bit that her father owned a distillery, I thought in Austria, but turns out to be in what's today is the Czech Republic. And I didn't know that her mother was called Felice, the same my grandmother's mother, so my great-grandmother, same as my name, that I was named after her. So on it went. And then the guide suggested that I should then contact the Prague Museum, because that's where my grandmother's side of the family came from originally. And it went on like this, and finding more and more information. I then found out, went on a tour of all these places with Peter. We went to Slovakia, we went to Czech Republic, Vienna, of course, and we found so much information because the archives in all these places are incredible. Since then, I've tried to research my father's family, who are British, and it's really difficult. Whereas in all these Eastern European countries, and because of the Nazis, there are meticulous records that they kept. They did try to destroy a lot of them, but a lot of them still carried on.
Now, your grandparents, you mentioned that your grandmother's family had this distillery, and your father's family were really different. Your grandfather's family were really different, and they both came from, I mean, contrasting different backgrounds. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that. They're both German-speaking, and they're both Jewish, but that's about where the only similarity ends.
Yeah, well, I didn't even know all of that, but my grandmother came from a wealthy family. Her father had a big distillery making liqueurs for by royal appointment to Edward VII at the time, and also to the Kaiser, and it was a very big concern. And
tell us just briefly there about the liqueur, because we did find it, didn't we?
Oh yes. Well, when we went to,
What was it called? What was it called?
it was called Altvater, which means grandfather, and which is also the name of the mountain nearby.
In Moravia.
In Moravia, which is part of the Czech Republic, which was actually in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they called themselves Austrians at the time and spoke German. But the liqueur was made of all sorts of herbs, and it was meant to be very good for the digestion.
So we were told that it was no way you could find it.
Yeah, I was told that you couldn't buy it anymore. But we were going out for dinner the first evening and walked past, on the way to the restaurant, we walked past an off-license.
Like you do.
And there in the window was Altvater, bright yellow, sort of not very nice looking. Anyway, we bought a bottle of it and bought it.
Two bottles.
We took it home, and I didn't like it very much, but
well, it was. If you ever had green chartreuse or yellow chartreuse, it was a bit like that.
Yeah.
Not a thing you'd rush to drink, but it wasn't bad.
Anyway, so by contrast, my grandfather came from a very poor family. He was one of 11 children, surviving children, and lived in the foothills of the Tatras Mountains in Slovakia. And they had a small holding where they grew a few things, and they had a couple of cows and a few hens, and they're pretty poor. They just managed to scrape by. They had no heating, obviously. I'm not sure if there was heating there, but well, they had a fire. But in winter, it was very, very cold in the mountains. They brought cow in from outside, and when it was into the kitchen to warm the house, and when it was particularly cold, they brought in 2 cows. And so anyway, my grandfather, age 15, the house was incredibly, a cottage they lived in with 11 children, and very overcrowded, and it was obviously he was encouraged to leave home, and so at 15 he left home, left school and went to Vienna to seek his fortune. And he had two brothers who lived in Vienna already. One was a butcher and the other one was starting out in the clothing trade. So when he first arrived in Vienna, his butcher brother offered him a room in his apartment to stay in and a job, which my grandfather didn't really like very much, but he stayed there for a bit until he got going in his own business, which was he decided to sell silk stockings, and then joined his other brother in the clothing business, and they grew their business quite successfully. Started with a market stall, then it became a shop, then it became a big business with factories, and really quite good.
Remarkably, he did this over a period, I think, something like 6 years.
I think in those days,
So 21 by the time he was sort of made his way in the world.
yeah, I think in those days it was probably as long as you had an idea, you could do that from being penniless if you really were keen and, got going.
So given these hugely different backgrounds, how do they meet? How could they meet?
Okay. Well, as well as my grandfather having his stocking business, he was very keen on sport, and he became the vice president of a big sports club in Vienna called Hakoa. Now, Hakoa was, at the time, the biggest sports club in Europe and probably, we think, in the world. And this sports club had different things. It had an athletics track, tennis courts, swimming pool. It had a wrestling team, a fencing team, a boxing team, all sorts of different teams who went out to compete, but also for the ordinary person who didn't want to take part in competitions, they could join the club and go and play those sports. Anyway, he took the football team, because that's what he really enjoyed, was football. He took his football team to London to play West Ham United, and they beat West Ham 5-0, and they were the first foreign team ever to beat a British team. And
It was a bit of a shock, I think.
yeah, for this, amateur, well, they were all amateur, I suppose, then. But anyway, on the way home, to say thank you to the team, congratulations, he thought he'd take them to Paris for 5 days. So we went to Paris, and meanwhile, my grandmother was studying history of art and French at the Sorbonne. She did a course there. And she was in the Louvre one day, and my grandfather took his football team to the Louvre, and that's where they met. Literally bumped into each other, and they were of very different backgrounds. They would never have met normally. And
I think your grandmother heard him speaking German.
she heard him speaking German. 1923. 1923. Yeah, sorry, 1923 this was, when they met. And then, yes, yeah, actually 100 years ago in September, last month. And anyway, she thought he was okay, but he fell in love with her instantly, he said, and he bombarded her with roses until she agreed to go out with him. And they went out in the 5 days in Vienna, and then somewhere along the line, she agreed to marry him. And
they came back and they got married and went to honeymoon in.
They had their honeymoon in Venice, and I'll show you some pictures later. There they are in their swimming costumes there. And 1924. Meanwhile, my grandmother was playing tennis more and more seriously.
They went to live in Vienna.
They went to live in Vienna, yeah. Meanwhile, she was playing tennis more and more seriously. And although as a child, her father didn't always let her, he was very much a sort of Victorian father who he said he saw that she had talent at the piano, so he made her practice all the time. And yeah, she was allowed to play a little bit of tennis, but not too much because it might damage her fingers. And but then when she got to Vienna, and her husband then was by then president of her Hakoa club, she had lots of opportunity to train at the club and with the tennis coaches there. And by 1930, she became tennis champion of Austria, and she played all over Europe and in Egypt. She went all over the place, either by car or on trains.
And she played the big names at the time,
And she
Helen Jacobs and others.
she did. And she had, in passing, she had my mother, their only child, in 1926. And it really was sort of in passing, because she went back to playing tennis when my mother was 4 months old. So she didn't have much maternity leave. She chose that, and she just carried on playing tennis all over the place. And my mother was left with a nanny, and
But they had a great life in Vienna. Vienna must have been a fascinating place to live, particularly then in the sort of late 20s, early 30s, because it was very much the cultural capital of Europe, wasn't it?
yeah, they had a wonderful life because they both loved music. So they went to the opera, to concerts, and to the theatre, and of course, lots of sport. And yeah, they had a very, very nice life indeed. And then by the 30s, by 1933, things began to change over the border in Germany. But then also it carried on over into Austria. And by 1937, my grandmother was banned from playing in any tournaments in either Austria or Germany. But she managed to carry on playing in the south of France and in Switzerland, places like that, for quite some time.
But gradually it reached a point where the organisers of tennis tournaments didn't want to have her around.
No, they didn't, because of her Jewish religion. Well, I didn't even know anything about that, because as a child.
But we'll come to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But because you had no knowledge of your background as a
No.
child, which is really one of the reasons why you came to write the book, wasn't it?
Mm.
Tell us a bit about that now, as well, on the subject.
Well, when I was a child.
Was it put this way? Was it a normal childhood in London?
Okay. Yes, well, my father was British and I knew my mother was Austrian because she had a bit of a German Austrian accent. But she was very, very much against all religion, and brought us up. Although my sister and I were sent to schools that were probably, if anything, Church of England, but she didn't want to have anything to do with religion, because once she left Austria, again, she wanted nothing to do with religion or politics, because she was 12 years old when she left Austria, leaving behind all her school friends, her language, and had to start all over again. It was very confusing for her, and obviously for her parents as well.
But let's go back to the timeline now. We have a quick break in London, and slowly, as things got worse in Germany, their life became really quite impossible, didn't it? They realised that somehow they had to get out. And at this stage, I mean, we're looking at all the newspaper cuttings we researched. I mean, life was intolerable, wasn't it?
It was very
Particularly
difficult.
after the Anschluss.
Yeah. And my grandmother, who wasn't religious at all, thought, why is this happening to me? Why can't I just be left to play the sport that I love? She couldn't understand it at all.
And again, always the belief that, oh, well, this is a passing thing, it'll all be over in a few months.
Mm-hmm.
And so finally they decided they had to go. This was after the Anschluss, and things got very difficult then, didn't they, with Aryanization?
Yes, my grandfather was asked by the Nazis to Aryanize his business and the sports club. Now that meant getting it ready to hand over to the Nazis. So he had to hand over all the books, all the details of all the how the businesses were run, both of them. So his textiles business by then was very large and important in Vienna. So they were interested in that, and also in the club, because they wanted the premises, big clubhouse, a stadium, and football grounds, football pitch, and.
But they didn't want the members of the club.
No, but they didn't want the members. So he had to do all of this, get it ready to hand over. But he realised that if he finished the job, he would be thrown into prison like other people. They were all taken to Dachau. So he knew he had to leave at that stage and get my grandmother and their daughter, my mother, out. And he planned this very carefully so that they all three left separately. My grandmother carried on as though she was playing tennis, took her tennis rackets and got on a train, and if anyone asked, she was off to another tournament, and got to Prague, where they thought they'd be safe. And
I think everyone thought they'd be safe in Prague for very long.
And my mother, meanwhile, a child of 11 going on 12, she was sent with her nanny up to northern Bohemia, to the sort of wilds of northern Bohemia, village there, where she waited until they somehow communicated with my grandmother to then meet in Prague as well. Meanwhile, my grandfather was much more difficult for him because he had to hide because he knew the Nazis wanted to.
Well, he was on the run.
Yeah, because they wanted him. He hadn't finished the job. So he hid, and then when he thought it was going to be okay, he managed to get a train to the border, just before the border, and then he hired smugglers to take him across the border on
Riverboat.
on a small boat. There are lots of parallels to today, down a river, into Moravia, Czechoslovakia, as it was, where he would be safe. And he managed to do this, crammed into a little boat. Quite an adventurous journey. Got to Prague, and they all met there, and they thought that would be okay. And then, of course, they weren't okay there because the Germans were waiting across the border to invade Czechoslovakia next.
So then your mother managed to leave. Your grandmother and
My
your mother.
grandmother and my mother managed to get a flight to London, and where they were sponsored by the sister-in-law. This is my grandmother. My grandfather had a sister who lived in London, where her husband was a doctor in London, and they were able to sponsor them because you couldn't just arrive from mainland Europe, Nazi-occupied Europe. You had to show that you had enough money, which was £50 per person, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that was huge in those days.
And they only had temporary visas because.
And they only had temporary visas because no one was willing to give them visas, permanent visas. They thought they'd go to Australia, but
rather than Rwanda.
But they'd wait in London. And my grandfather, again, had to escape with a smuggler, yet another one. This time he went over the mountains into Poland, and this was recorded in newspapers at the time. He crawled on his stomach for 18 miles through the snow to get across the border, and then he took a train and finally got to Warsaw, where together with others they chartered a flight, £600 for the flight, for the whole flight, for 13 of them, he borrowed money for this, so he didn't have any money left.
And they had nothing, all their possessions were gone.
Yeah, everything had to be left behind. And anyway, he got to London, where he was met by my grandmother and my mother. But 400 Jews arrived that day from mainland Europe at Croydon Airport, which was London Airport then, and they weren't all allowed to stay. In fact, most of them were sent back or threatened with being sent back, and people. One man said, I have newspaper cuttings saying this, one man was going to throw himself out of the plane rather than go back, and it was pandemonium. And anyway, my grandfather was allowed to stay because he had family in London, so he was lucky.
So it must have been a very different life as penniless refugees from this grand life of opera or whatever in Vienna.
Very much so. He, as soon as he could, my grandfather started work again, but it wasn't really till after the war. Meanwhile, his sister gave them a room in her house. She lived in Hendon in North London with her husband, 2 children. And so suddenly they took in my grandparents and my mother as well. So they were very squashed in this little terraced house, which my grandmother didn't enjoy at all, coming from her nice, spacious apartment in Vienna. And
her ambition really was to play at Wimbledon. It's always been her ambition, hasn't it?
Yes, all my grandmother had wanted was to play at Wimbledon. And I'm now going to
absolutely
read a little bit from my book.
I think you say your mother went away to school and she was a bit on her own, wasn't she? A bit depressed, as you would be. You thought she'd play tennis, go out there and get a tennis racket and see what happened.
She didn't really know where to begin, but she met another refugee in London who was from Hungary. And he said, well, you must join the Queen's Club. And he sponsored her. And
I think the setting there is that the Queen's Club was, as it is today, very elite. So it must have been remarkable that as penniless refugees, she managed to make a name for herself.
She'd taken with her some cuttings from newspapers, Austrian newspapers, saying, how she was, and also a picture which I've got saying Tennis Champion of Austria 1930. So she was able to show those, and that helped a lot. Obviously helped get her membership.
It must be very daunting.
Yeah. So this is London 1939. That morning, Liesl took herself to Barons Court Underground Station and strode through the hallowed entrance of the Queen's Club. It was a dank Tuesday in March, and the place was nearly deserted. She picked up her membership card at the desk, found her way to the ladies' locker room, and changed into her new clothes before wandering over to the clay courts where a couple of men's matches were taking place. From behind the netting of a third court, she lingered, watching a strapping woman with wavy grey hair practicing a powerful service. Liesl was transfixed. In her day, this woman would have been a formidable competitor. When she changed ends to gather her balls, the woman wandered over. Tennis isn't much fun on your own, is it? She said with a smile. No, Liesl said. I am new and I don't know anyone here. Well, if you've got nothing better to do, come on court and hit me some returns, or at least play ball girl for me. Liesl bridled at this last suggestion. My name's Jane, the woman continued. I'm on the committee and I try to get on court whenever I can. Liesl nodded, took up her position on the baseline, ready to receive the first serve. Several minutes passed while the older woman refilled her sack of balls. As Liesl waited, she realized with a jolt she hadn't hit a tennis ball for 2 years. Nearly 9 had slipped by since that wonderful day when she'd been crowned Austrian champion. But as waves of anti-Semitism swept across Germany and Austria, invitations to national and international tournaments waned. Organisers had been increasingly nervous of asking Jewish athletes to compete, particularly ones of Liesl's calibre, who might win. At that precise moment, a white Dunlop Fort tennis ball plopped onto the clay in front of her. Liesl stepped forward and hit a flat forehand drive with pent-up force. The ball leapt from the strings, clearing the net at the highest point by barely half an inch before touching the baseline in a puff of chalk and crashing against the back netting. The second ball came harder and faster, but her cross-court backhand return twisted Jane's racket almost out of her hand before skidding off into the tramline. A few minutes later, and breathing heavily, Jane jogged to the net and shook Liesl by the hand. Please forgive my French, but who the hell are you? Oh no, I'm not French. I'm Austrian. Well, I was Austrian until Hitler took away my nationality. My name is Liesl Herbst, and I'm going to play at Wimbledon. Jane studied her before replying. I think, given a little coaching at the Queen's Club, you are going to do just that. But first, you have to stop being so damned angry.
Tell us a bit about your mother, because we haven't really talked much about her. And how was her life affected by having to leave Vienna the way she did?
Well, when she went to school, she was bullied for being German speaking because people didn't, the war had started by then, and she was an alien to them. So it was very difficult for her. And my grandparents, you would have thought, might have been sent to the Isle of Man, where lots of German and Austrian and other people were sent and interned there, but they weren't, because I think it's because they were Czechoslovakian and their papers said that they came from Moravia and Slovakia, and therefore
probably no one knew where Moravia was.
No, so they weren't Austrian, so they were allowed to stay in London.
Um, but you said growing up, the H words, both Hitler and Holocaust, were never mentioned in your household.
That's right, never ever mentioned, and nor religion. So I didn't know about that. But should we go back to the tennis?
Yeah, of course we get back to tennis. Yeah. So after 1939, she played that one time.
Yeah, so in 1939, my grandmother played at Wimbledon. And in order to qualify, she had to beat three other women, and which she did. And one of those women was called Susan Billington, and she was the grandmother of Tim Henman. So my grandmother beat her and went on to play at Wimbledon. She didn't do brilliantly because she hadn't played on grass till she came to England. Tim Henman's grandmother passed on her tennis talent to her grandsons, but unfortunately, my grandmother didn't pass on any talent to me at all. So I'm terrible at tennis.
But actually, some of the skiing would be more your sport.
Yeah, because both my grandparents grew up in mountainous areas, and my grandmother skied when she was young. Not my grandfather, but
and then they went on to play after the war.
Yes, during the war, Wimbledon was more like a farm. There were goats and cows and chickens and all sorts of animals wandering around. And in fact, the centre court was bombed. And
Her grandmother always said she took it as a personal affront to her. And in fact, I think the Luftwaffe were aiming for a Triang factory that was making machine gun parts down the road. But then after the war.
So after the war, in 1946, my grandmother was back playing at Wimbledon again. Meanwhile, she'd had TB during the war and had one lung removed, because there were no antibiotics then, and
probably the only tennis player ever to play at Wimbledon with one lung.
And also she had a smoking habit as well, so she smoked and carried on smoking even after that, and played tennis. And
With the two of them.
So my mother was by then a teenager. She was at university, and they played doubles together, and they remain to this day the only mother and daughter ever to play doubles together at Wimbledon. And when I did my research and I went to the museum and archives at Wimbledon, they told me that that record will never be, very, very unlikely it'll ever be beaten, because my grandmother was over 40 at the time. So, and it was obviously an amateur sport at the time too, so standard wouldn't have been anything like today's standard.
So I want to talk to you about how researching the book and indeed writing it has changed you. It was very much a, forgive the cliche, voyage of discovery, wasn't it?
That's
Personal
right.
discovery.
Yeah, because I knew nothing. I knew that my grandfather had Jewish heritage, because that was mentioned, and his sister in London was, lived in North London, was very much practiced her religion. But my grandmother, she converted when, and so did my mother. They were christened, and so because they thought my grandmother thought that would make them safer, which it didn't. But so I grew up not knowing anything really about it, and it was never spoken about. In fact, my mother did say to me, never tell anyone you've got Jewish blood, because people don't like Jews, so it's better if you just keep quiet about it. And so I did. And then when I was doing my research, I realized then that I found myself starting to say the same thing to my children, and I realized this is wrong. They should be able to say who they are and not have secrets. And so it's made me admit to my background, and it's made me also think about refugees and the parallels today and then. And also it's made me realize that my grandmother had terrible survivor's guilt, and I didn't know about this before, but her sisters both died, which I'm not going to talk about much here because you'll have to read my book to find out more. But her sisters and her mother, who was a widow at the time, were all killed by the Nazis. And my grandmother, I think, I know she felt terrible guilt that she didn't try harder to get them to leave when she left. And in fact, one sister, her middle sister, called Trude, was married with a teenage daughter, and they were taken into a work camp, where basically the Nazis wanted to work people to death. It wasn't a death camp as such.
Slave labor.
Slave labor. And but they were rescued by the partisans, it's a little known thing that happened in history where they opened the doors to 3 different labor camps and let people out, invited them to join the fight against the Nazis. So it's called the Slovak National Uprising, and people actually fought back, but they didn't succeed.
It lasted for about 4 or 5 months.
Yeah, but then in the end, everyone was shot. So my grandmother didn't feel as bad about that sister because, first of all, she didn't know as much detail as I know today, because I've been to the places where they died, and there's a museum where I managed to find a lot of information my grandmother probably never knew, fortunately. But she felt guilty about leaving them behind, but much more so about her other sister, her elder sister, who was disabled, and her elderly mother. And they were both sent to a camp just outside Prague, where, again, the methods for getting rid of people there were starvation and overcrowding, so that people, they didn't have gas chambers. It was a halfway house, for Auschwitz. But
I think they died when they were booked on a transport to Auschwitz, weren't they?
Yeah, they never got there. So they both died of disease. And my grandmother never stopped feeling guilty about this. And in the early pictures, and I have lots of photos, which my grandmother managed to leave with a friend in Vienna, and she got them all back afterwards. 12 photo albums full of pictures of my grandmother looking really happy. But then when I knew her in London later, when I was a child, she never really looked that happy. And I think it was survivor's guilt. And I know this because in any big disaster, whether it's an earthquake or whether it's a tsunami or 9/11 or the Holocaust, those who survive feel terrible about the people that didn't. And they feel, what could we have done? Could we have done something? And it's a terrible thing for
There is
them.
a known fact called second generation.
Second generation trauma as well, which is something that you pass on, the trauma that they went through. You can pass this on through the generations. And I think by one thing I did, it's very cathartic for me writing my book, and it really helped me with this. And also my children as well, our children.
I mean, Sats was so childhood. It wasn't until 1991 when I was around on the scene, you learned that your great grandmother was called Felice.
No, I know. Exactly. No.
The whole thing was a huge secret.
Yes, my grandmother didn't speak about her mother because this was the person that she felt the most guilty about.
And what about your German language skills?
No. Yes, I never learned German. My grandparents and my mother kept German as a secret language, so they spoke among themselves. So I didn't learn
It's
German.
not strictly true, because actually speak perfectly reasonable German. But
I then did German at school, learnt German at school, not to a very high level, but just enough that I could understand a little bit of what they were talking about, and a little bit helped a little bit with my research. I did try and learn Czech to help me with my research. That was absolutely impossible. It's the most difficult language I've ever seen.
and there's quite a lot of German. There's quite a lot of German words in the book, aren't there? Foreign words, because of the audio version of the book.
Yes, when an actress was reading the book for the audible version, she phoned me up to ask for pronunciation of some of the words. And because there are 350 foreign words in the book, I hadn't realized that. Mostly German, and a lot of them are place names, but she had no idea how to pronounce them, and I had a little bit more idea. But
you had that one. You managed to help with the German, but if anyone's a Czech reader and speaks Czech and reads the book, they'll probably find some terrible things. Yeah. Well, that's just about it. I just want to read you a review from That's 1.5 reviews from Amazon, which probably says more about the book than you are. This one's someone called Bridget, whoever she may be, is an Amazon reader. This is a wonderful and profound book. The author writes simply and beautifully. Her research into the circumstances surrounding her close family members past, has produced a telling history as well as the most readable story. Her descriptions of the wider family and their background makes them come alive to the reader. The account of the events of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, was so fresh and vivid that we were moved to tears. We both learned so much from the book. It made us think how very emotional and also cathartic the experience for the author of researching her own family's history must have been. She has illuminated her grandparents and her mother's indomitable battle to overcome tragedy. The book touches on many profound issues, such as survivor's guilt, we just talked about, and should prove illuminating and supportive to many. The descriptions that the author has conjured up, largely using the power of her own imagination, are powerful and believable. They ring entirely true. Obviously, it brings on the point of how much of the book is true.
Well, every name in the book is a real name. I didn't obviously know a lot of them because they died before I was born. And my grandparents both told me lots and lots of stories about their childhood and growing up. And so I knew, so all of that is true. Otherwise, I did a lot of research. I spent from 2015 until just before the book came out, really, researching, going to all the different places, talking to people. And as I mentioned before, the records are amazing. And there are lots of newspaper cuttings. My grandmother did have after she died, I found a suitcase full of all her tennis cuttings. Lots and lots of them. She played in tournaments all over the place. So yes, everything there is based on truth. But what I have done is, because I wanted it to be more readable, I have added dialogue to make it, rather than just, I didn't want a dry history book. I wanted something that people would be able to read and enjoy. So the dialogue is obviously made up, but my grandparents, I know exactly what the sort of things they would have said. And I can remember actually distinctly some of the things my grandmother said in particular.
They told you stories about the early years more than the war years.
That's right. It was a blank, the time of coming to England, although I did know about my grandfather's escape, and that is in lots of newspapers at the time.
In our research, your research came around, we actually found your grandmother's home in this little town in Moravia, didn't we?
That's right, yes. I had photo albums, as I said, and I took one of them with me when we went to Prague and then to Jägendorf, which is now called Krnov, which is where my grandmother was born.
Where the distillery was.
Where the distillery was. And another night, I mentioned one night we went past going to a restaurant, we found the drink that was made. We found my grandmother's house.
And the moments of inspiration before dinner, curiously.
And I knew what it was called, and we were just walking around the town, and then suddenly I saw a house with a name outside saying Villa Vestreich, and Vestreich was my grandmother's maiden name. And then we thought we'd come back the next morning because it was dark, getting dark, and take some photos, and see if we could go inside. But it looked like government buildings, so we thought we'd better take pictures first on the outside and then go in, because we might not be allowed to take pictures. So that's what I discovered, that it was a job centre. Yes, my grandmother would have been horrified that her family home is now a job centre. But I did manage to go in. We went in and looked around. Because I had the photo album, I could show the woman who was in charge there, who didn't speak a word of English, and I don't speak Czech, show her the pictures and say, look, that room, same as that. And she understood. I'd looked up the word for grandmother too, so she did understand. And then first thing she said was no photo, and so I knew I couldn't take any pictures inside, which was a pity.
I think taking photos of government buildings in any country is a dangerous thing to do. So we were careful to do that quietly before you went in. In fact, that picture there, explain that picture there.
Yeah, that is On the left is my grandmother, and on the right is her sister Trude, the one that was freed from a camp and joined the resistance,
Standing in the garden.
standing on the steps outside the house. And I actually Peter took a picture of me standing on the same steps.
Well, it was a remarkable few years of research.
Yeah, and this is
Your
my
work-
grandmother over there in
Yeah.
the garden with her pet rabbit.
There's a honeymoon picture.
Yeah, and my grandmother playing
Yeah.
tennis. That one is in Poland playing tennis in a match.
This one at the front.
Oh, that's a family photo. Taken in their garden. And that's Trude, middle sister, my great grandmother Felice, my great grandfather Leo, and my grandmother there. And I don't know who those men are. I think they're boyfriends, cousins. I'm not sure. There
During the
were
First World War, I
during the
imagine.
First World War, yeah, and that was also during the First World War because they borrowed coats, army coats. So that's.
So that, I think, is it. If anyone would like to ask any questions, please just fire away.
Please do ask me any questions.
The couple.
I know.
I'm sorry. There's a mother, there's a daughter, and
Oh yes, yeah.
it's mother and daughter. on the
That
house.
that's my mother
Pick it up,
leaving
pick it up.
Vienna with her nanny and governess. Yeah. Yes, sorry.
It's just for our, we have people joining us online, so if you, sorry.
Of course, we have to
Half an hour
repeat
see
the question.
Sure. Peter, would you remember to repeat? the
Yes,
questions?
absolutely, yes.
Yes, you.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean about survival skill, because my father was a bomber pilot in World War II, and he started operations in September 1940, which was right at the beginning. No bomb at all was dropped until June 1940, and he through operations, full tour operations. Then he was made an instructor, and he was flying as an instructor one night on a training mission where the crew he was training were just about to be signed off, and the aircraft caught fire, and he got all the crew out. One member of the crew got out. He was terrified, and so Dad landed this aircraft in the middle of the night in the open countryside, and he was badly injured, and that stopped him going on any more operations. So he missed nothing for the dreaming. He ran down. And I asked him once, did he make lots of friends in the area? And he said, no, you couldn't afford to make friends. Because they're all being told all the time, it's too upsetting. And he undoubtedly lived his life with survived ill. And as I get older, I'm more aware of how he handles himself. So it's a very powerful thing.
Just to repeat that for our online audience, your father was a bomber pilot in World War II,
Yes.
and he was on a training mission, and the plane caught fire, and he survived, but obviously many of the others didn't from the train.
No, all of them got out.
They all got out.
One 19-year-old Canadian trainee pilot who was too traumatized to jump out.
Yeah, except for one, but
I went to try and save his life.
Yeah.
And maybe killed myself. Or I
Survive.
jump out.
Yeah.
And so he very bravely decided to try and landing a large aircraft in the open countryside in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, is very dangerous.
But he obviously felt survivor's guilt for the rest of his life.
Yeah. Because he wasn't bombing in 1943 when they were all being killed all the time.
Yeah. And you rightly say you asked him once if he made friends in the RAF during the war, and he felt he couldn't make friends because he didn't really know how long anyone was going to survive for.
Too upsetting to make.
Too upsetting to make friends. Yeah.
It was a very powerful man.
Yes.
In terms of your grandmother, did her life overlap with yours for just a few years? Were you a young child when her life came to an end? And where was she in the UK in that latter part, please?
So, did you have many years, Felice, with your grandmother after they arrived in the UK, or did she die when you were? Did she die when you were quite young?
And where does she live?
And where did she live?
I had many years with her. In fact, she outlived my mother. and she died in 1990. So yes, I had many years with her, and she and her grandfather, because my mother died young, which was terrible for them. Tragedy once again, their only child dying before them, and they were more like parents. They became parents to me and my sister, and they lived in London. Yeah, they lived in Baker Street, as in Sherlock Holmes fame.
I'm interested to know what you, if you were to tell your grandmother now, what her reaction would be to you in terms of the book you've written about her life.
It's a good question.
Yes.
If your grandmother's alive now, what would her reaction be to the book?
She'd be horrified. Yes. Although she'd be pleased that there's a good picture of her with a tennis racket on the cover. But that picture. But I think she'd be horrified because she wanted me to keep quiet about everything. She, because of this guilt and fear of the same thing happening again, I think she'd be, I don't know.
I think she'd be very proud.
It's that part of her life, in terms of the way the world had changed and the way she communicated with me.
Yes, what were her feelings about in the last part of her life about the way the world had changed?
I think she was pretty pleased. She loved traveling, so she was suddenly able to travel all over the place. She became, when she gave up tennis, which was during my lifetime, she carried on playing at Queen's just, I think, once a week. She then took up golf in a very big way, and played in Portugal and played in Italy and went to the Caribbean. All these things wouldn't have been possible in her youth.
And she went back to Vienna.
And she did, and my grandparents went back to Vienna as well. My grandfather was hesitant about that, but my grandmother was determined. And then went back because they were music lovers. They went to Salzburg every year for the music festival. So they were fine. They didn't have any bad feelings about Germans or Austrians.
She went back to Vienna for a particular reason, and she was shopping.
Yes, she liked to go. She thought that she could only buy her underwear in Vienna, so she used to go shopping. The same shop was still there, yeah. So I don't know about what she thought about politics or anything like that, but certainly the ease of being able to travel. I think she loved that.
Well, I think she'd be very proud of what you've done, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and the other thing is she was also a keen skier, and my mother was too. And she was shocked by the change in ski equipment. So she was probably shocked by the change in tennis equipment as well. But she couldn't believe it, and she refused to change from leather boots to plastic ones. She gave up skiing when the leather boots fell apart.
Just a quick forward with what you're doing. You're a sort of granddaughter, but it takes people like you to tell a story because they're so reluctant not to tell it. Like my father was in the war, and that can tell all kinds of stuff, but they won't talk about it. So it takes the next generation in the hands of them to talk to them in whispers to get little snippets of information.
Absolutely.
Yes, you're saying that so many people after the war were not prepared to talk about it at all. And it takes people like Felice important to tell the story, which you feel very strongly about, don't you?
Yes. One thing I've learned from writing my book is how important it is to pass on stories. So now when I'm giving talks, I always say, older people, please tell their children and grandchildren all about their young lives when they were younger. And younger people, please make sure you ask your parents and your grandparents, because those stories will be forgotten otherwise. And that will be really sad. And if possible, write them down or record the person telling you about it, because once it's lost, it's lost. And I wish I'd asked my grandparents more than I did.
Everyone has a story to tell, and you ghosted a book, didn't you?
Yes, I ghost wrote a book. So I wrote a book for commissioned by a family daughter whose mother was 95, living in Weymouth. And she said, my mother's got an amazing memory. And I can't write, but I'd love it if you could write it down, interview her, and then write it down, pretending to be her. So I did that, and we went along together and interviewed her. And when we arrived, the 95-year-old woman said, "Oh, why on earth? I can't understand why my daughter wants you to do this, because I've led such a boring life. Why would anyone want to know?" But then when I started talking to her, it wasn't boring at all. She'd lived through World War II as a child, and she'd in the countryside in Dorset, and she had amazing stories to tell, things that I didn't know about, what she ate, what she wore, how they made clothes, how they grew their own food in the garden. And then she went, when she was a teenager, going to dances, and it was really, really fascinating. It was a really interesting story, actually. And it's just a story of life in those days.
She used to talk about going the dams in Bristol, dancing with GIs, actually jigging with the GIs, and things like that. And,
Well, you see-
charming voice, things like that. But she actually did that when she was watching.
I think it's these little
You need to
details.
say the question.
Question.
Hmm.
I think it's these little details like that about what people did during the war. Like in your Ghosted book, how they drew the line of stockings on their skin, on the back of their legs. Because, but stories like that shouldn't be forgotten. They should be passed on.
Well, I hope you're going to write yours down.
Well, my mum's sister lost her baby when going across the centre of Bristol, with a machine gun. She was running,
Wow.
lost her baby.
Mm.
Wow, you know what I mean?
Yes, they're saying that. What relation was it? Sorry,
It's my mum's sister.
your mum's sister.
She married a GI, which was
Yeah, and with machine gun in Bristol running. Yeah.
just running because there was a.
But will this all be written down so that
Well,
the future generations? Yeah,
Pass on it, you see, to
yeah.
It's just saying it's very important to pass all this on.
Joe, but
Yes, so thank you, Felice. You've yes, question for one of the online guests. When researching your grandmother, did you find out if she encountered any of the many remarkable figures in Vienna during the interwar period?
repeat the question.
You don't need to. Because,
Do we need to repeat the question?
please.
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So, a question from an online: Did your grandmother meet any remarkable people during that period between the wars, living in Vienna?
I don't know. She really sports people who probably people haven't heard of these days, but the Hakoah Club had some famous members. So
Susanne,
Friends.
you've heard since from someone in Melbourne, I'm sure,
yeah, about other tennis
from the famous tennis player.
famous tennis players. But members of Hakoah, there were Kafka, wasn't it? Franz
Yeah.
Kafka was a member, and they would have seen him. Whether they spoke to him, I don't know. One of my grandmother's best friend was, this is a bit far-fetched, but she was the mother of Noel Coward's boyfriend.
But yes, I suppose they would have mixed with all sorts of people at the opera and things, wouldn't they?
Yes,
Sounds to me like your book would make a wonderful film.
I think so. I hope so, yes. Yeah, I'm hoping that someone out there will say that and make it into a film. Yeah.
Are these the rackets that she played with?
Are these the rackets that she played with?
Did she play at the site that is currently Wimbledon, or the one previous to that on Walpole Road in Wimbledon? Do you know?
She played actually. Did she play at the other side of Wimbledon, Church Road or Walpole Road? I think she actually played on the courts where they are today. Is that not correct?
Mm. She did, and also, unfortunately, those are not her rackets. I don't have any of her rackets, and I think what I did is looked into where I could buy rackets of the same period, so they're as close as I can get.
And this is a Dunlop Ford about that period.
But
when they were white enough this.
yeah, I probably should dirty it a bit so it looks older. But yeah, I've tried to get the same racket as she would have used, because you can see, I think in that picture, the sort of markings on them. Yes.
Do you have any problems engaging Germany, Austria, or Prague, for example?
Do I have any problems going to Austria, Germany?
Because of the background, because what happened?
No, no problems at all, because I've been going, because my mother was Austrian, used to go to Austria every year to go skiing when I was a child. But growing up, not really knowing much about the history, my family history at that stage. No, I've never had a problem, really.
You have an Austrian passport.
And I now have an Austrian passport as well. So, no, because I think cruelty can happen in any generation, anywhere.
We just come back from Austria last Tuesday.
You just come back from Austria last Tuesday.
We went to the castle, which funny enough was the castle we used in where Eagles landed.
Yeah, so we went to the castle where he was landed.
And it was an extraordinary medieval castle. It was used for training ground or a training camp for the German army.
I know it was used as a training camp for the German army.
And it was incredibly.
It was incredibly atmospheric.
There, but you have to look for it.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I wouldn't do is go to the place where Hitler lived, or I wouldn't want to go Berchtesgaden or anywhere like that.
It's James Salzburg.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to visit places like that.
We did stay in the youth hostel with the children in Berchtesgaden. And because it had been built in 1933 by the Nazis, it was utterly luxurious. And I didn't feel it, it was just sort of,
Yes.
Last question about your grandfather.
Yes.
He lost everything when he came to England. He had nothing. Yet from the sound of it, he quickly became very successful again. What sort of business did he go into?
So the question is, what sort of business did your grandfather go into? Because obviously he got to England, because obviously he'd lost everything when he left. And it sounds as if he was, again, successful.
Yeah, he was always very good at finding. He was always very ahead of his time, and he knew stockings. It was no longer silk stockings. It was now, nylon stockings and tights later on. And he went back into that. I think he had lots of contacts because there were a lot of other refugees in that business. He started a business again from very small and built it up. And he decided only to employ refugees. So they weren't just refugees from Nazi Europe, but also his manager was from the Caribbean, and he was also a refugee. So he wanted to sort of only employ people that needed a job, really, and had a new country.
And so I always ask the question, growing up and with a father who didn't actually find tights, he manufactured them when they first came in, didn't discover tights. Did you get tights free as a teenager?
He did give me tights, but he didn't want to give me very many because he said he had the sort of attitude of wartime where you mend things rather than buy new ones or be given new ones. So if I asked for more, he said, "Well, can't you darn them? Can you mend them?" So no, I didn't get as many as I would have liked to have from him.
He was a remarkable man, and once he died. What age was he when he died?
91.
And right up until the end, he was thinking ahead. He took you off for a shopping expedition one day.
Yes, first of all, he bought me my first record,
which was
Beatles record, and then he bought me my first computer as well later on, an Amstrad computer. So he was always thinking ahead.
I remember him saying he felt this was the future. He was right.
Yeah.
I think that's about it, right?
Yeah.
That's one last question for.
Yeah.
The final question.
John?
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight.
And
I'll be selling and signing copies of my book at the back there. And for anyone who's listening online, you can buy it on Amazon or in your local bookshop. You can order it if it's not there in your bookshop.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And thank you for
Thanks.
thank you very much. If you know.